So next we'll investigate connective tissue. Connective tissue is a type of tissue in which cells occupy much less space than the extracellular material. It's usually involved in binding organs to each other, such as in the case of a tendon binding a muscle to bone. It supports and protects organs, and most cells of connective tissue are not in direct contact with each other. That is, there is a large amount of extracellular material or matrix. Connective tissues are usually highly vascular. They're richly supplied with blood vessels, and they're most abundant and widely distributed. Connective tissues are the most abundant and widely distributed of the primary tissues. Connective tissues have many different functions. Just to give you a little insight, connective tissues range from things like tendons and ligaments to bones and cartilage and even fat and blood. So, binding organs, in the case of tendons and ligaments, supporting with bones and cartilage. We also see physical protection. The bones of the cranium protect the brain, and the ribs can protect the contents of the chest cavity. The immune protection will see white blood cells, as blood is also a connective tissue, and movement. Bones provide lever systems, along with muscles allow various movements of our skeleton. Connective tissues also involved in storage when we consider fat as energy storage, and then the bones will also store things like calcium and phosphorus. Connective tissues are also involved in heat production, so metabolism of fat or brown fat in infants. Brown fat's a slightly different variety of fat that has a lot of heat release in its consumption. Also, transport is a role of connective tissue, as we'll see when we examine blood. Fibrous connective tissue is the most diverse type of connective tissue. It can also be called fibroconnective tissue or connective tissue proper. Nearly all connective tissues contain fibers, but the tissues considered here are classified together because their fibers are so conspicuous. So let's take a look at the types of cells we might find in fibrous connective tissue. There are fibroblasts. Those are the cells that produce the fibers and the ground substance, that gelatinous stuff. And we'll find macrophages. Macrophages are involved in cleanup, so they phagocytose foreign material and activate the immune system when there's foreign matter in place, an antigen. Macrophages arise from white blood cells or monocytes. We'll examine those in upcoming chapters. Leukocytes, or white blood cells, will see neutrophils. They'll wander and search and attack bacteria. There are lymphocytes, which react against bacteria and toxins and other foreign material. And then we'll see plasma cells. Plasma cells synthesize disease-fighting antibodies. These also arise from lymphocytes. We'll see mast cells. They're found alongside the blood vessels. They secrete things like heparin, which inhibits clotting, and histamine, which dilates the blood vessels. Very important in inflammatory response. Adipocytes are fat cells. They store triglycerides, or fat molecules. Now, the fibrous component of connective tissue, we'll see collagenous fibers, reticular fibers, as well as elastic fibers. The collagenous fibers are the most abundant of the body's proteins, about 25%. They're tough and flexible, and they resist stretching. Things like tendons, ligaments, and deep layers of the skin are mostly collagen. It's less visible in the matrix of cartilage and bone, but collagenous fibers are still there. Also, reticular fibers. Reticular fibers are thin collagen fibers. They're coated with glycoproteins. They form a framework of organs like the spleen and lymph nodes. We'll also see elastic fibers, which are much thinner than collagenous fibers, and they branch and rejoin each other. And they're made from a protein that's called elastin. The key thing about elastic fibers is they will stretch as well as recoil. To stretch, well, that's one thing, but to recoil and come back to the original shape is very important. Elastic fibers account for the ability of the skin, lungs, and arteries to spring back to their original shape after they're stretched. Fresh elastic fibers are yellowish, and therefore they're often called yellow fibers. The third component of connective tissue is the ground substance, that gelatinous or rubbery consistency. It results from three classes of large molecules: glycosaminoglycans, proteoglycans, and adhesive glycoproteins. Glycosaminoglycans, or shorthand GAG because that's a big word, are long polysaccharide molecules. They're composed of unusual disaccharides called amino sugars and uronic acid. They play an important role of regulating water and electrolyte balance in the tissues. Chondroitin sulfate, that's one that you might have heard of. It's involved in joints. It's the most abundant of the GAGs. It's responsible for maintaining the stiffness of cartilage. Hyaluronic acid is another GAG. This is a very important compound. It's viscous and slippery. It's the substance that forms the lubricant within the joint capsule. It constitutes much of the vitreous body of the eyeball also. Very, very slippery substance, allows our joints to glide smoothly across each other. Proteoglycans are gigantic molecules shaped like a test tube brush. They form thick colloids that create strong structural bonds between cells and extracellular macromolecules. They hold the tissues together. Basically, these bristled brushes stick to each other and hold the cells of the tissues tightly to each other. We'll also see adhesive glycoproteins. These are protein and carbohydrate complexes. They bind to the plasma membrane proteins and to collagen and proteoglycans on the outside of the cell. They'll hold all of the components to tissue together, as well as mark pathways and guide migrating embryonic cells to their destinations. So now, before we go on into the types of fibrous connective tissue, take a moment to outline the three components of connective tissue. We've got the cellular component, we've got the fibrous component, and then we have the ground substance component. What do you remember about each of these categories? So now let's take a look at the types of fibrous connective tissue. First, there are loose connective tissues, and then there are dense connective tissues. The loose connective tissues have a lot of gel-like ground substance between the cells. They are such tissues as areolar and reticular. The dense connective tissues are much more dense, as in they're filled with fibers between the cells. Less ground substance, more fibrous component. We'll see dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. Now, the fiber orientations are really what varies in the dense connective tissues. Areolar tissue is loosely organized fibers. There's abundant blood vessels and a lot of seemingly empty space. That's where the ground substance is. Areolar tissue possesses all 6 cell types, so it has a very diverse cellular population. The fibers run in random directions. They're mostly collagenous fibers, but we'll also see elastic and reticular fibers present. It's found in tissue sections from almost every part of the body. It surrounds blood vessels and nerves. Nearly every epithelium rests on a layer of areolar connective tissue. The blood vessels are going to provide nutrition to the epithelial layers and waste removal from them. It supplies infection-fighting leukocytes. Those move about freely between the fibers of the areolar tissue. Here's some slides of that areolar tissue. Again, we have a true histology slide, as it would seem under the microscope, and then we have a faded out version with the cells highlighted. You'll notice that there's lots and lots and lots of apparent space. That's what's filled with the ground substance. Here are some elastic fibers, as well as some collagenous fibers, much lighter. And then also fibroblasts, the cells that would actually secrete the ground substance. Reticular tissue is a mesh of reticular fibers and fibroblasts, much less diversity in cell types. It forms the supportive framework for all the lymphatic organs, or the stroma. It's found in lymph nodes, spleen, thymus, and in bone marrow. Again, you can see these two slides next to each other, the true slide as you would see it under the microscope, and then one that's been faded and highlighted. We'll see the leukocytes here as well as some of these reticular fibers. You can start seeing the distinction between reticular and areolar fibers. Dense regular connective tissue. Well, there's no mystery why it's called regular, because these fibers are very regular. Remember that in dense connective tissues, there's less ground substance and more fibers. It's densely packed with collagen fibers. We'll see in here fibroblasts, but their nuclei are very condensed. They've been smashed between these tight layers of collagen fibers. We'll see this tissue in tendons that attach muscle to bones and ligaments which hold bones to bones. Dense irregular connective tissue is easy to tell apart from dense regular because there's a lot of irregularity in here. Again, it's densely packed but randomly arranged collagen fibers, and there are very few visible cells. In the burned out version over here, you can see some of these fibroblast nuclei, and then this open space, that's where we'll see the ground substance. Dense irregular connective tissue is able to withstand unpredictable stresses. We'll see it in the deep layers of the skin and in capsules around organs. It's very tough. Okay, so far we've explored all of the epithelial tissues. And you've outlined all of those different types of tissues and perhaps where they're found and some of the characteristics of them. Now we've added to that outline. We've added the connective tissues. So there were two general classes of fibrous connective tissue: loose connective tissues, under which there were two, and dense connective tissues, under which there were also two. Put those together in an outline. Some of the places that they're found, and some characteristics of each. And then we can move on to look at adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is yet another class of tissue. This is the third type, adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is simply fat. It's tissue in which the adipocytes, the cells, site will always mean cell, are the dominant cell type. The space between the adipocytes is occupied by areolar tissue, reticular tissue, as well as blood capillaries. Fat is the body's primary energy reservoir, so it's very important. The quantity of stored triglyceride and the number of adipocytes are quite stable in a person, as in fat cells are not stimulated to divide after adulthood. They're just stimulated to become more full. Fat is recycled continuously to prevent stagnation, so older fat is used first and it's replaced by newer fat. Fat also provides thermal insulation. It's involved in cushioning organs. You'd be very surprised to see how much fat there is around things like the kidney or the eyeball. It also contributes to body contours. The female breasts and hips are a great example. And on average, women have a little bit more fat than men, and that makes sense because from that fat they would be able to support a growing fetus. In fact, too little fat will cause a reduction in female fertility. Say below about 12% is considered very unhealthy for a female. We're likely to lose our reproductive cycles. Most adult fat is called white fat, and I already introduced to you brown fat that we find in fetuses and infants and very young children. It's a heat-generating tissue. Here are some slides of adipose tissue. You can see here the non-enhanced slide, the regular one you might see under a microscope. Very characteristic sort of open white spaces, but these white spaces are actually where the triglycerides or the fat itself is stored. You can see in the enhanced version there are some blood vessels and also the nuclei of some of the adipocytes. They're pressed to the outside of the cell because of all the lipid or triglyceride that's stored inside the cell. Okay, quick review. So what do we have so far? Our different classes of tissue. We had all of our epithelial tissues, 2 different kinds, as well as fibrous connective tissues, 4 different types of fibrous connective tissues. Then we've looked at other connective tissues such as adipose. Now we'll move on to cartilage, another type of connective tissue. Cartilage is a supportive connective tissue. It's very flexible but has a rubbery matrix. It gives the shape to the ear and the tip of the nose. Chondroblasts produce matrix. Chondroblasts are the cells that produce matrix. They surround themselves with matrix until they become trapped in little cavities called lacunae. Chondrocytes are cartilage cells that exist inside the lacunae. So they're chondroblasts until they manufacture enough matrix to surround themselves, at which point they become chondrocytes. The perichondrium is the sheath of dense irregular connective tissue that surrounds elastic and most hyaline cartilage, but not articular cartilage. It contains a reserve population of chondroblasts that contribute to cartilage growth throughout life. As they produce more matrix, the cartilage grows. There are a couple of different types of cartilage. We've got hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. We'll begin with hyaline cartilage. It's very clear and has a glassy microscopic appearance because of these unusual fineness of the collagen fibers in there. It's usually covered by a perichondrium, usually articular cartilage, the costal cartilage, that is the cartilage between the ribs and the vertebrae, the tracheal rings and cartilage, the larynx, and the fetal skeleton are all produced from hyaline cartilage. It allows ease of joint movements, it holds airways open, and moves the vocal cords. Elastic cartilage has a distinctly different appearance. It contains a lot of elastic fibers. Remember, elastic means we can change it out of shape and then rebound it to its original shape. It's also covered with perichondrium. It provides flexible, elastic support. We find that in places like the external ear and the epiglottis, the flap that prevents us from getting food in the windpipe. Third type of cartilage is fibrocartilage. Again, has a distinctly different appearance. It contains large, coarse bundles, you can see here, of collagen fibers. It never has a perichondrium, so that makes it different than the other 2 types of cartilage. It also resists compression and absorbs shock. We'll see it in places like the pubic symphysis at the front of the 2 pelvic bones, the menisci, the cushions that we might see in the knee joint, and on the intervertebral discs, the discs between each vertebra, as shown here on the right-hand side. So now you have 3 types of cartilage to add to your list. Note where they might come from and some of the characteristics of each. All this outlining is really going to help you put your project together on tissues. Bone is another tissue type. It's a connective tissue. Bone can either mean the organ of a body, like the femur, the mandible, and it could be composed of multiple tissue types. Or there's bone tissue, which is actual osseous tissue that makes up most of the mass of bone. There are 2 forms of osseous tissue. We'll spend a lot of time with this later on in the course. There's spongy bone and there's compact bone. Spongy bone is spongy in appearance. It has delicate struts of bone called trabeculae. It's often covered with compact bone. We find it in the heads of long bones and in the middle of flat bones, like the sternum. Compact bone is much more dense. It's highly calcified and has no visible spaces. Has a much more complex arrangement, and the cells and matrix surround vertically oriented blood vessels in long bones. It's highly organized tissue, as you can see here. Most compact bone is arranged in cylinders. They're highlighted over here in the figure on the right. They surround a central Haversian or osteonic canal that you can see here. The blood vessels and nerves travel through these canals. The bone matrix is deposited in concentric lamellae. You can see that there are extra layers and layers and layers. These are the matrix. They're like onions around each central canal. The osteon is the central canal itself and its surrounding lamellae. Between each layer of lamellae, we'll see osteocytes, which are mature bone cells. They occupy spaces, again, called lacunae. We'll see little canaliculi that lead through the different layers of the osteon to other little lacunae with osteocytes within them. And finally, there's a periosteum, which is a very tough, fibrous connective tissue that covers the whole bone. So this green area would be periosteum. Blood is our final connective tissue. Blood is involved in transporting cells and dissolved matter from place to place. The plasma is the blood's liquid portion. It's actually ground substance, so it's not gelatinous at all in this case. The formed elements, like the red blood cells, the erythrocytes, or the white blood cells, leukocytes, and platelets, are the cellular component of blood. So now we've explored types of connective tissues, as well as all the types of epithelial tissues. You should have a substantial list building. Spend a little time reviewing each of the slides in your textbook or in this presentation, and become familiar with those before you move on to the next section, where we'll examine nervous and muscular tissues. These are the excitable tissues.